Thank you so much, Volker. It's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you so much for organizing this opportunity for us to talk about and introduce what felt like a baby that was a very, very long time coming. So this is actually the first time I've spoken publicly about the book. And I can't tell you how much of an anxious parent I was. I thought it would never come, that I would never see this day. So it really is wonderful to see it out in print and online, and to have an opportunity to tell you a little bit about the journey of this book, really, if you like. So I thought in the 10 to 15 minutes I have available before passing on to Sophia, I would say a little bit about how this volume came about. And to do that, I actually have to tell you a little bit about how my academic journey came about. So please forgive me if it's a little bit self-indulgent, but it is actually the autobiography of the book as well. So for those of you who are familiar with my work and with my academic work, you might know me as a British academic, and I have indeed been a British academic for my entire professional life. But in fact, I was born in Australia to parents who had immigrated from Hong Kong. And that's where I grew up and studied conscientiously, as one does as children of immigrants, did very well at school, and then was in that position of thinking, what am I going to do with my life? I have no idea. So, you know what happens? You get a good score, you think, well, I'll go to law school. So that's indeed what I did. And in fact, that was not my plan. I was in fact going to be an accountant, but my mother said, hey, you've got the points. Why don't you do law as well? So I did a combined law and commerce degree at the University of Melbourne. And I enjoyed that, but I didn't get really excited about it until about the third year. So a double degree in Australia is a 5-year course. And the light bulb went on in about year 3. And I started to get what it is to do legal reasoning. And I started to get really good at it, and I started to really enjoy it. And so by the end of my 5 years, I thought, you know what, I'm not done. I'm not done. I want to dig deeper. I want to take this legal analysis further and pursue a higher level of study. So fortunately, I was in the very fortunate position of getting a scholarship to come to Oxford, to the legal motherland. When you're an Australian lawyer, the place to go is to come to the home of the common law. So I went to study at Oxford University to do the BCL. And I found it so freeing to be in this incredible sort of intellectual and cosmopolitan hothouse that I didn't feel ready to go back to Australia. So I sent off 30 CVs to law firms in London and got 30 rejections. So this was really depressing. I thought, okay, that door is closing. What am I going to do? And I just so happened to see an advertisement for an academic job at Oxford University in the law school to be a commercial lawyer and to be a tutorial fellow at St. Anne's. And I thought, hey, I can pretend to be a commercial lawyer. So I stuck a CV in, and lo and behold, they gave me the interview, and then they gave me the job. So here I was at the age of 23. I'm going to be an academic, Mom. So that's what I decided to do. And so I rocked up completely green. I had no PhD. I had never practiced law. I didn't know what the hell I was doing, but that's okay. We just make it up as we go along. But I did know that I needed to find a field of research and I needed to publish. That was a requirement, although back in the day, it wasn't very high pressure. It was just something you were expected to do. And you'll love this. In 5 years of your probation period, you just had to publish 2 articles. That was it. So I thought, okay, in the next 5 years, I have to come up with 2 papers. I think I can do that. But I was conscious that I had to be quite careful in my choice, because I knew that I was going to start beginning a journey of research inquiry that would shape the way in which I spent my time thinking, I guess, and investigating. So I was still stuck with the dilemma, okay, so what am I going to, inquire into? And I thought, well, I really enjoyed drawing on both the economics and the law. And I'll be really honest with you, by the time I'd done 5 years of legal study and then another 2 years of reading cases at Oxford, I was done. I was done with legal reasoning. I was done with reading cases. It was almost like I got really good at doing the jigsaw puzzle, and I no longer found that satisfying. So I thought, I want to go deeper. I want to get underneath the law and really start to understand what is going on in the background? What actually shapes the world in which you live? And what is the law doing in these different contexts in which it's being utilized? So with that in mind, and with the sense of, I suppose, I mean, maybe naive public calling, hoping that I might contribute to making the world a better place. I was in my early 20s, don't forget. Um, I felt like there was a calling to work in the public dimensions of public policy rather than being a private lawyer, even though I had been employed to become a commercial lawyer, but nobody knows that now. Nobody remembers that. And so I thought, okay, let's focus in this kind of field. And by then it's the mid to late 1990s. And here in Britain, the privatization and regulation of the utilities was in full swing. And what became known in everyday parlance as the regulators, the heads of those regulatory bodies that were regulating specific utilities, had become quite a talking point. There was a scholarship that was growing up around them. And I had long been aware of the kind of constitutional awkwardness of these bodies, these independent regulatory agencies, or quangos, as they were called in Britain at that time, for those of you who were old enough to remember the language that was used at that time. And this was all broadly going on under the general rubric of regulation. So I thought, I think here is a good place to start. So that's where I started my inquiry, and I was keen not to pin myself down to utility regulation. I was quite conscious that I never wanted to become known as, oh, she's the gas girl, or the whatever industry girl. So I was really conscious of trying to keep a broader analytical frame in thinking about regulation more generally. And I started focusing my research inquiries in that direction. And it was during those early years at Oxford that I soon became friends with another young Australian academic, also in the law school, Bronwyn Morgan, who also had grown up in Australia. And then she had, like so many of us, left Australia to do postgraduate study, but she'd chosen to study at Berkeley. And we both found ourselves here in the Oxford Law School, not knowing really how we were going to navigate this academic journey together. But we discovered that we had overlapping interests in what is known in the US as the administrative state. And we had quite a lot of common interests in that field. And this prompted us to consider the possibility of putting together a postgraduate course with the rather broad title of Regulation back in 1999. Well, neither of us had any previous experience teaching a course like that, so we had to put the materials together ourselves. And our thinking was to try and encourage students to interrogate legal institutions beyond the confines of a narrow focus on legal doctrine. So our ambition was to cultivate in our students what Roberto Unger calls an institutional imagination, one that highlights the challenges of institutional design in public policy making and practice, and to enrich and enliven their understanding of law and its contribution to the regulatory enterprise. But we soon discovered there wasn't any book, which is, when you're teaching, a bit of a bummer, because it's so much easier when you've got a good textbook to guide the organization of your teaching materials and to help your students. And what we really wanted was a scholarly yet accessible text that drew together a broad range of disciplinary perspectives that all focused on different issues that arise in the regulatory enterprise. So we had to collect together our own disparate materials from legal, social, scientific, and policy sources and try and organize them around the conceptual frame that we had thought of in the teaching of this course at Oxford Law School. And so we took this material together and we put it together into a teaching pack, as you do when you're teaching a group of students under a specific module. But as we started to teach this course, we found that it was a bit of a struggle for us and particularly for our students. They found it really hard going to engage in such an eclectic array of materials from different disciplines they were not familiar with. So many struggled to identify how these different literatures related to each other, or indeed to the legal tradition that they had been trained in. In other words, we saw that there was this acute need for a book that provided an organizing frame for investigating all of these disciplinary approaches to regulation, which came from a wide variety of different sources. And it was this need that provided the impetus for us to write the first edition. So it was that original postgraduate BCL and your course in mind that we began our journey of putting together the teaching materials and turning them into what we hoped would be an accessible text. And in doing so, our audience was no longer confined just to legal scholars, but we also wanted to be able to speak to those with a general interest in regulatory policy, who were interested in and who were unaware of this body of literature that came from a variety of sources, but was united under the broad concern to understand and interrogate different facets of regulation. And so the result of that was the first edition. And you can see the very straightforward cover. Thank you, Sophia, on the slides there, which was part of Cambridge's Law in Context series. And in fact, Cambridge only acquired that series a year or two before we actually signed up to write the book, before it was actually owned by a company called Butterworth. I'm not sure whether they're about anymore, but it's since been part of a very distinguished series that Cambridge University Press continue to maintain, which seeks to develop this understanding of law that goes beyond the confines of legal doctrine. So in that first edition, for those of you who have any familiarity with it, you'll know that it's quite different from the second edition that Sophia is going to speak to shortly. It was very much state-centric in its focus. So don't forget, this was the early 90s, and although globalization was happening, it certainly hadn't acquired the depth and pervasiveness of the reach that it had now 30 to 40 years after the sort of 1970s, when that process started to happen. It was also much more focused at on state actors as well. So we didn't really take a hard look at the role of non-state actors in the regulatory enterprise. And we only had one chapter, in chapter 6, that sought to take the conceptual lens that we'd developed in the domestic national context and tried to think about what the implications of it were once we took regulation above and beyond the state. And the result is that first volume, students found it a really useful teaching resource, but to be honest, it was still quite hard going. It had quite long extracts in it, but what did help was the commentary that we put together that helped them to navigate the relationship between the different literatures that we brought into the frame, and provided some questions to help think through the issues that were raised in that chapter. So that became a really useful teaching resource for us when we were teaching at Oxford. But also I subsequently moved to King's College London as a chair, and I also taught regulation there using the book. And at the same time, I had a visiting position at Melbourne Law School, where I had taught a 5-day intensive master's course on regulatory policy and practice for a number of years, and it became the mainstay of that course. But over time, it became really apparent that the book itself was outdated, and that there was a lot more going on than was actually represented in the chapters of the book. And so I would supplement the book with independent teaching materials to bring the students up to speed on where the current debates in conceptual thinking was. And it remained in this kind of, outdated form, but it was still selling. And I was very aware, and so was Bronwyn, that there was an acute need to update it. But by the time, the sort of late 2010s rolled out, and certainly by 2015, even though the book was really outdated, by this time, my own research had become very focused on the regulation of technology, which was a move that happened when I moved to King's to help start up a research institute there that was focused on the governance of emerging technologies. And by this time, I was deeply embroiled in policy level discussions about what was then called big data, now called AI, right at the frontier of understanding. And I was so busy that I just couldn't even contemplate having the time to do an update of this book, even though it was sorely needed. But nevertheless, the impetus for actually starting work on a second edition came in two sources. The first was to having moved to the University of Birmingham. We won a big tranche of funding to develop a new MSc, which was targeted at legal scholars, but sought to give them training in data science and in regulatory studies, so that they would be able to, or at least equipped to try and take on the challenges that we now see unfolding in seeking to navigate the digital transformations that continue to unfold at a pace. So that was enough to acquire funding to support our postdoc research assistants to put some materials together to update the book. And in the meantime, as Bronwyn and I were starting out on that journey, we received an inquiry from Sofia, who I had some acquaintance with beforehand and had some useful discussions. And I knew that she was a very promising scholar who was working in this field. And she wanted to know when and if we were doing a second edition. And it was on that basis that we thought perhaps she would give us a little extra oomph in putting this book together. And it's on that note that I will hand over to Sofia to continue its journey. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So indeed, thanks so much, Karen, for introducing where it comes from, basically. And indeed, I mean, I must say that I actually bought the book, the first issue of the book, when I was writing my master's thesis on actually the relationship between regulation, so sector-specific regulation, and competition, and that was in actually in 2008. So just a few months after the first edition of the book was published. And I thought the book was extremely useful. And I remember reading it from the very first page until the last one. And I thought, well, this is such an interesting book. And I thought to myself, well, I wish I would have had a chance to actually to study this book with the authors at Oxford. Then many years later, I found myself teaching a course on regulation, but this was the only book on regulation that I knew, because all the others were quite focused on public administration, or they were a little bit outdated, like the very famous book by Baldwin. It had been written many years before, so it was not really a reflection of the current state of regulation. So this is when I approached indeed Karen and Bronwyn, asking whether they were planning to actually update the book, and then they proposed very kindly to me to actually join the team and to help them write the second edition of the book. Then during this process, it was also during the COVID period. So of course, we actually did not meet in person for a very long time. Bronwyn was not able to continue joining us. So basically, this is why at the end, there's just me and Karen as co-authors of the book. This book is a little bit different from the first edition, because we decided to organize it in a bit of a different way, because we thought that if we're writing a book for students, we have to be able to actually make sure that our students get some background knowledge. And, and also this background knowledge could be, skipped if the students already have, this, have acquired this knowledge because they have studied economics, for example. So basically, we decided to have a book that has three main parts. The first one being an introduction, because the thing is, regulation requires always some kind of background knowledge. Most of regulation comes from, this idea of government intervention to correct market failures. And this is a traditional perspective on neoclassical economics that very often we just assume that students would have. So in the first edition, very often it was there was this reference to market failures, information asymmetries, but monopolies. But if you have never studied economics, you don't know what it is. So then we thought, well, let's just have one first part where basically we bring everybody up to speed. Because this was definitely something that I struggled with my students, because I had students that had studied economics, but I also had students that had studied law, political science, and I had no clue of what a monopoly was or monopsony. So we thought, well, let's just have this first part. And we decided that we're going to do it on the grounds of three main pillars: economics, risk, and technology. Because basically, these are the driving elements of regulation. Economic regulation being, of course, a traditional way of looking at regulation, but still the most dominant way of approaching regulation when it comes to state-based regulation, of course. And then risk regulation has been definitely one of the biggest shifts in regulation, from the idea of neoclassical economics to focus on, correcting market failures, to the more recent idea of actually regulating to manage risks. But then, of course, we live in an area where technology regulation has become absolutely essential. So then we thought, well, the third pillar should be on technological change. And this is a part that actually stands just on its own. So for example, now I'm teaching the book to a group of master students from strategic management. they have all had quite a lot of courses on economics, on risk management, and on technology. So I'm not, I'm skipping these 3 chapters because they do not need it. So I basically told them, look, if you don't remember or what, what transaction cost is, you can just, check for chapter 1, but you're not compelled to actually read it. I must actually thank here, like Volker, who actually kindly reviewed the first chapter of the book several times and gave us really helpful feedback. So he's like, he has been like definitely like our supporting economist. Because, as an expert in economics of regulation, I personally thought that he was, the best placed person to give us, comments on the first chapter. So he's definitely like a person to like, once again, thank for all his inputs. So having written this first part, then we moved into like the regulation part, which also exists in the first edition, but we rewrote almost everything basically. So basically, we start with, we guide the book through with a number of questions. So why do we regulate? Do we actually need regulation? How do we regulate? And what happens when regulation doesn't work? So how do we enforce it? And what happens afterwards? So then we have, like a chapter on theories of regulation, one on regulatory policy, which, combines all the different methods on cost benefit analysis, regulatory impact assessment, consultations that help regulators decide whether or not to regulate, and also what kind of methods and evidence to consider when doing so. The book then evolves into like a couple of chapters on regulatory instruments, which is of course, one of the key elements of regulation. And then of course, then here we consider something that we had not considered in the first edition, which is the prevalence of private and hybrid regulation. So basically here we have placed a strong focus on standards, certifications, and many other regulatory instruments that were not as prevalent in the 90s as they are now. Another part that we also improved is the part on compliance and enforcement, because it has become so important to the practitioners that actually use our book. So we have a strong part that it can be used also by those who are just part of the compliance department, and basically do like GDPR compliance, for example, or DORA compliance. So this is something that we thought it would be good to also like address. And finally, this part closes with a part on enforcement, so basically like, who reviews regulation? How do you go to court? What kind of like judicial review can you expect? What kind of redress mechanisms exist beyond judicial review? So this is like, I would say the core part of traditional regulation, but, completely rewritten to address basically everything that, had changed since 2007. The last part is basically focused on 2 main elements, which have become very central to the literature on regulatory studies, which are regulatory legitimacy and regulatory accountability. So why do people, regard regulation as legitimate? Why do people comply with it? And this is a question that has been mostly addressed by philosophers, namely political philosophers, but it has become also quite important for those studying regulation in practice. So basically, we decided to have a chapter that combines political philosophy literature on legitimacy with more recent empirical studies on regulatory legitimacy. And then we close with a chapter on accountability. When you think of algorithmic accountability of supply chains, this is an element that has become, really central to how we study regulation nowadays, to the complexity of regulation. And because of that, we decided it was really important to have like a closing chapter that expanded accountability beyond what we had actually discussed, or Karen had discussed in the first edition of the book. The book further, like the concept of the book, it has remained, fairly the same. So as Karen was explaining, we basically have selected extracts. We have not been able to cover every single person that has been written, like every single scholar that has written on regulation, but we try to select pedagogical pieces. This was actually the key criterion, to have pieces that were not only like well-known, but by well-known scholars, but also pieces that actually were pedagogical. In doing so, we also try to like keep an eye on, having like a good gender balance, a good balance of young scholars and senior scholars, because it was something that it's not always like accounted for, but for us was quite important. In some chapters, this is more visible than other chapters, but this also has to do with the topics, of course. So basically, this is just an example of how the book looks like. We have commentary, and then we have extracts, which we try to keep as short as possible, but also as representative as possible of what the key message of that author was. We did introduce an innovation in the book in the second edition because it was something that was important for teaching. So we have now boxes, what we call boxes. And these boxes contain either case studies or extra information. So yesterday I was teaching, for example, theories of regulation to my students, and we discussed some case studies on regulatory capture. And some of them had already read it, so they were actually able to discuss with it. And they said, well, this like this, we always have extra examples. So here's an example of a box. An idea is to have like something that students can read about, they can do some research on. And we have, included this extra information because we thought it was important to present regulation as a living discipline, as a living field that is not just, like theory, but it has actually it's really all around us. And this is something that, I think, we really try to convey in the book. Another element that is really important for teaching are the discussion questions. This is something we maintained from the first edition. We include a number of discussion questions, and I think discussion questions also depend on, have different levels. The reason why we also have questions at different levels is because this book is basically adequate to be taught and be used as a supporting instrument at different levels. In terms of teaching, I teach it right now this semester both to be bachelor students and to master students. And the book has different has chapters that are like a little bit more difficult and a little bit more accessible. This the same goes for discussion questions. So we really try to have to offer a panoply of extracts and questions that actually could serve different levels. And we hope that the lecturers that are using the book will actually adapt the book to different levels of difficulty. So having said that, what our book tries to do is basically to follow the history of regulation, to show that, the regulation has evolved quite a lot from the very beginning, from the ICC, the creation of the ICC in the US, the Sherman Act, all the way through the New Deal, the 90s regulation period, and it actually comes closer to us. So basically, this is why our book, even though it was finished in 2023, in December, we try to include examples that were relevant throughout this period to actually introduce students to changes of the regulatory states. So in doing so, we try to actually convey not only the nature of the regulatory state, but also to provide instruments and methods to students and PhD students to actually get acquainted with the reality of regulation. And I believe this is quite important because when I'm teaching now, regulation, we see basically the word regulation everywhere. So basically, with the inauguration of President Trump, this is something that has been really on the news. And for example, the last issue of The Economist was actually on deregulation. So basically, I brought The Economist to class, and I showed to my students the cover of The Economist, and basically I invited them to read one of the articles inside, which is on deregulation. I just told them to understand what deregulation is. You need to understand first what regulation is. And, you have to go beyond all these populist narratives that you need to deregulate, you need to deregulate to actually save money, because ultimately this is not always true. You can cut, the number of words in regulation, which is needed, but this does not mean it will have a positive economic effect on the economy. So in that sense, this is basically a book that tries to have, tries to introduce students so that they can understand not only just the reality, the news, but also that they can actually have a set of instruments that will help them hopefully in in conducting research on regulated fields and have a better sense of actually how law and regulation works. How climate change, regulation is, impacting different actors. So basically how the world is changing. So on that note, I would like to close. We have a voucher, a discount voucher, 20%, which is valid only this year until the end of the year. So everybody can use it, and just don't go on the US website if you're like based in Europe, because that will definitely like create some some issues. But like this is the book voucher that you can use, share with your students, friends, like colleagues, because this is valid until the end of the year. So thank you very much, and we welcome your questions.